I always believed betrayal happened to other people. The stories you hear at brunch with friends, the whispered scandals in office corridors, the late-night confessionals after one too many glasses of wine. But me? Emily Carter? No. I was the exception. Or so I thought. For 10 years, Jonathan and I had built a life together in the glowing heart of San Francisco. We lived in a stunning Victorian on a hill, with views that wrapped the city in gold every sunset. He was the marketing director at a booming tech startup. I was once a rising star in corporate law, until I decided to step back, to support him, to nurture us. It wasn't a sacrifice, I told myself. It was love. But sometimes love blinds you. Sometimes it holds your head gently between its hands, and whispers just loud enough to drown out the truth. It all began on a Tuesday. A stupid, ordinary, forgettable Tuesday. I was tidying up after dinner, Jonathan's plate still half full, because he said he needed to rush back to the office for end-of-quarter reports. I'd heard it 1,000,000 times. But tonight, as I cleared the plates, his smartwatch buzzed on the counter. He'd left it by mistake, and maybe in another universe I would have ignored it. But in this one, something, call it intuition, call it fate, call it the invisible shiver up my spine, made me glance. So excited. To toast my promotion tonight, same place as last time. I told my wife I'm working late. I stared at the screen, blinked. The message came from Olivia HR. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the edges of my reality blurring, reshaping. Olivia, the young, ambitious HR manager Jonathan often praised at dinner, her name floating casually into our conversations. Always harmless, always professional. Wasn't she the one he said reminded him of his younger sister? My hands trembled. I shouldn't jump to conclusions, right? Maybe this was a joke, a misunderstanding. Maybe, but deep down I already knew. Sank into the nearest chair, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. My mind raced. Storm into the restaurant and confront them? Scream in front of his coworkers? Demand answers? Watch him squirm? But no, that wasn't me. That wasn't how I wanted this to play out. Suddenly, a memory flickered. A cocktail party a few months back. Jonathan introducing me to Christopher Wu, the charismatic CEO of his company. Christopher, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, who had pulled me aside at one point, and, half joking, half serious, remarked, "Your husband's talented, but he needs to watch his alliances. Not everyone in this company plays fair." My breath caught. In that moment, the fog of betrayal cleared just enough for a different emotion to break through. Not grief, not rage, but determination. If they wanted to play games behind my back, they had no idea who they were messing with. I was Emily Carter. I may have stepped back from the courtroom, but I hadn't forgotten what it felt like to win. Within the hour, I had Christopher Wu on the phone. My voice didn't shake once as I explained what I'd found. To my surprise, he wasn't shocked. In fact, he sounded grimly satisfied, as though confirming something he'd suspected all along. He invited me to meet him the next day for coffee, not as the humiliated wife, but as an ally. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker far below, feeling the weight of a decade pressing down on me. Memories flashed. Our wedding at a vineyard in Napa, the late nights we spent dreaming of children, the long talks about building a future together. Was it all a lie? Was I the lie? The woman who believed so deeply in a man who no longer saw her? But no, I refused to sink into self-pity. If this marriage was going to end, it wouldn't be with me on the floor, broken. It would be on my terms. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. The next day, as I prepared to meet Christopher, I took my time getting ready. I pulled out a dress I hadn't worn in years, deep emerald green, cut to command attention. I straightened my shoulders, applied lipstick with a steady hand, and looked myself in the mirror. For the first time in months, I saw not the quiet, supportive wife, but the woman I had once been. Sharp, brilliant, unafraid. Christopher met me at a small cafe near the ferry building. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Over black coffee, we laid everything on the table, the messages, the whispers of project manipulation, the suspicious expense reports. Christopher's mouth tightened with each revelation, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. And then, just like that, we had a plan. Jonathan and Olivia were planning to celebrate her promotion that night at Gary Danko, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Reservations were impossible without serious connections, but Christopher, of course, had those. He and I would show up unannounced, not to create a scene, but to make a point, to remind them that secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when you least expect it. As I left the cafe, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't just about catching a cheating husband. This was about reclaiming the power I'd handed over piece by piece, year after year, thinking it was love. This was about standing tall, even when the ground shook beneath me. That night, as I waited outside the restaurant, heart hammering in my chest, I realized something. Whatever happened inside those doors, I was already winning. Because I was no longer the woman sitting quietly, at home, wondering where her husband was. I was the woman who knew. And I was the woman who was about to remind him, and everyone else, exactly who I was. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this jaw-dropping story. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing you powerful, unforgettable stories every week. Now, here's a little question for you. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done? A. Storm into the restaurant and confront them immediately. B. Stay calm, gather evidence, and plan a calculated confrontation. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. We can't wait to see what you think. Emily sat in her car, parked a block away from Gary Danko, staring at her trembling hands on the steering wheel. Her heart raced with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years, not even in the heat of courtroom battles. She knew tonight wasn't just about catching Jonathan red-handed. It was about dismantling the narrative she had built for herself for a decade. She forced herself to take a deep breath, fingers tightening around the wheel. She wasn't here to explode in fury or sink into a public scene. She was here to execute a plan, and she couldn't do it alone. Earlier that day, when she'd met Christopher Wu at the cafe, he had looked at her not as some betrayed wife, but as an equal. He saw sharpness in her eyes, the kind only people who had tasted high-stakes games understood. Over 2 intense hours, they laid out the pieces of the puzzle. Jonathan's affair with Olivia from HR wasn't just personal betrayal. It was corporate misconduct. Promotions handed out through backroom deals, expenses misappropriated, ideas stolen and repackaged for personal gain. Christopher had admitted he'd been watching Olivia for a while. She had risen too fast, too smoothly, her projects always landing just right, her numbers always sparkling. But he had lacked proof, until Emily arrived with text messages, suspicious bank transfers, and insights only a spouse could provide. Together, they formed an uneasy but powerful alliance. Now, as Emily checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, she felt the weight of everything they'd prepared for. She smoothed a hand over her emerald dress, took another deep breath, and stepped out into the cool San Francisco evening. Christopher was waiting near the restaurant entrance, his phone in hand, dressed sharply in a tailored suit that radiated quiet authority. He gave her a subtle nod as she approached. "You ready?" he asked softly. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. More than ready. They walked in together. The maitre d', recognizing Christopher immediately, guided them in without hesitation, Emily felt the curious eyes of diners follow them, the hush of conversations dimming for just a moment as they passed. Her pulse quickened as they neared the back of the restaurant, where Jonathan and Olivia were seated. And there they were. Jonathan, her husband of 10 years, leaning close to a woman who wasn't his wife. Olivia, all glossy hair and sharp laughter, touching his arm with intimate familiarity. They clinked champagne glasses, their eyes shining with shared triumph. Emily felt something twist deep inside her. Not just pain, but fury. Not just betrayal, but humiliation. Christopher didn't hesitate. As they reached the table, he spoke in a voice that carried effortlessly across the room. Jonathan. Olivia. What an unexpected surprise. Jonathan's head jerked up. His eyes widened as they landed on Christopher, then flicked to Emily. For a heartbeat, his face went slack with disbelief. Olivia froze, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. Emily stepped forward, her voice smooth and cool. Congratulations, Olivia. Quite the promotion. And quite the celebration, too. Olivia's mouth opened, then closed again. Her face drained of color. Christopher raised an eyebrow, his expression sharp. We've been meaning to talk, Olivia, about those project numbers, about the expense reports, about the, how shall I put it, less than transparent practices we've uncovered. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Emily, what are you doing here? His voice was low, urgent, almost pleading. Emily turned to him slowly. What am I doing here? She gave a small, humorless laugh. Jonathan, you lied to my face and emptied out part of our joint savings account to fund your girlfriend's condo. What I'm doing here is showing you that you're not as clever as you think you are. For a moment, silence reigned. All around them, diners stared, hushed whispers rippling across the room. Olivia's eyes darted to Christopher. Mr. Wu, I can explain. Christopher lifted a hand, stopping her cold. You'll have plenty of time to explain, Olivia. But not tonight. Not here. His voice turned cold. We'll handle this in the office tomorrow, with legal present. Jonathan's face had gone pale, a sheen of sweat breaking across his brow. Emily, please. Let's go somewhere private. We can talk about this. Emily felt her chest tighten, not from the old familiar urge to forgive, but from the hard-earned clarity she had been building over the last 24 hours. There's nothing left to talk about, Jonathan, she said quietly. You chose this. You risked our marriage, our home, our future. For what? A cheap thrill? A shortcut to success? She shook her head slowly. You gambled everything we built together. And you lost. Jonathan reached out, but Emily stepped back, her gaze steady. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. She wouldn't cry here. Not tonight. Christopher gave a short nod. We're done here. Together, Emily and Christopher turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan and Olivia frozen at the table, the weight of their downfall settling over them like a heavy, inescapable fog. Outside, the cool night air hit Emily's face, sharp and refreshing. She drew in a long breath, her hands trembling slightly. Christopher touched her shoulder lightly. You were extraordinary in there, he said softly. Emily let out a shaky laugh. I don't feel extraordinary. You will, Christopher assured her. Give it time. As she stood under the city lights, watching the cars glide past, Emily felt something shift inside her. For the first time in months, she wasn't just reacting, wasn't just surviving. She was reclaiming herself. She didn't know exactly what the next days would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. She was done playing small. That night, she went back to the house, their house, and packed a bag. Not because she was running away, but because She needed space. She booked a room at a friend's loft by the Embarcadero, somewhere she could breathe, think, begin to piece herself back together. Alone in the loft, she sat by the window, staring out at the glittering Bay Bridge, feeling the quiet ache of grief curling in her chest. But alongside it, flickering like the first hint of dawn, was something else. Resolve. She hadn't just confronted her husband tonight. She had confronted herself. The parts of her that had been asleep, the ambitions she had shelved, the fire she had dimmed to keep someone else's dreams alive. And she realized, with a mixture of sorrow and fierce determination, that she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Emily stood alone on the balcony of the loft, gazing out over the quiet shimmer of the Bay Bridge. The night wind stirred loose strands of her dark hair, cooling the last flush of adrenaline that had surged through her veins just hours earlier. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the chill, but from the vast, aching emptiness spreading through her chest. The confrontation at Gary Danko was over, the battle lines drawn, the truths laid bare in a room full of strangers. But this was the part no one warned you about, the hollow, echoing silence that follows when you've torn down a part of your life. Inside, her overnight bag sat untouched on the bed. The tea Christopher had insisted she make before he left sat cold on the nightstand. She hadn't touched it. She couldn't. Her phone lit up again with Jonathan's name. She didn't need to read the message to know its contents. Apologies. Please. Maybe even anger. Jonathan had always cycled through, those when he felt control slipping from his fingers. Emily stared at the glowing screen, then carefully, deliberately, powered off the device and placed it face down. Not tonight. She needed a night without his voice, even through pixels. She lowered herself to the floor near the window, curling, her knees to her chest. Outside, the world continued, cars gliding by below, couples walking hand in hand, the hum of a city that had never paused for her heartbreak. Her mind drifted backward, unbidden. She saw herself 10 years younger, standing on a beach in Napa Valley, sunlight gilding her hair, as she promised herself to Jonathan. She remembered how his hands had trembled slightly when he slid the ring onto her finger. Back then, she believed that tremble was love, raw and earnest. Now she wondered if it had always been uncertainty, even then. Emily let the memory settle like dust before shaking herself free. This was dangerous ground. The past, the what-ifs, the relentless questioning of every moment she once thought sacred. She couldn't live there anymore. She rose slowly, brushing off the stiffness in her joints. Crossing the room, she pulled out a legal pad from her bag. Old habits, she thought, die hard, and began making a list. Not of grievances or sorrows, but of steps. Concrete, forward-moving actions that would tether her to the future rather than the wreckage of the past. She began with the basics. Contact her lawyer, first thing in the morning, arrange a meeting with the financial advisor, draft a formal letter to the board, following up on the disclosures she and Christopher had delivered. Find a temporary place to stay, not just a friend's loft, but a space of her own. Make a list of personal belongings she wanted from the house. Halfway through the list, her pen slowed. A line had formed between her brows. What did she really want from the house? The answer surprised her. Not much. Not the expensive furniture they'd picked together. Not the framed photos lining the hallway. Not even the delicate dishes they'd picked up during their honeymoon in Italy. Those things felt like artifacts of a version of herself she was no longer willing to carry forward. What she wanted were her books, her grandmother's jewelry, a few paintings she'd collected over the years, and the old leather-bound notebooks she used to keep in her home office, the ones Jonathan had once teased her about, calling them her dragon's hoard of thoughts. Everything else could stay behind. She was no longer interested in salvaging a life built on deception. As dawn crept along the edges of the city, Emily felt her body finally sag with exhaustion. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat near the window, watching the sky change. There was no sense pretending she'd sleep. Her mind was too wired, too raw. She thought about Olivia, the sharpness in the younger woman's voice, the way she'd brushed her hair behind her ear while flirting with Jonathan at dinners, where Emily was also present. Had Olivia always known what she was doing? Had Jonathan? Emily suspected they had. But more than that, she suspected they hadn't cared. That realization ached worse than the betrayal itself. It wasn't just that Jonathan had cheated, it was that at some point, he had stopped seeing Emily as a person who mattered. She had become a prop, a fixture, someone to nod at and reassure, while his real ambitions, his real loyalties, orbited elsewhere. By the time the city stirred awake, Emily was dressed and ready. She left the loft and stepped into the cool morning, feeling the stiffness in her shoulders lessen just slightly with every block she walked. She wasn't sure where she was going at first, until she found herself standing in front of her old office building. It was an impulse, maybe even a form, of mourning. She hadn't been inside in years. When she left, it had been with the full intention of returning someday. But life, Jonathan, had other plans. Standing there now, she realized with a quiet pang that she might never go back. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. She wasn't the woman who had walked those halls anymore. Instead, she turned and made her way to the waterfront, where the air was sharper, clearer. She found a bench and sat, folding her hands in her lap, staring out over the water. She needed a plan, yes, but she also needed to breathe, to feel the weight of what had happened without letting it crush her. A voice broke into her thoughts. "Didn't expect to see you here this early." Emily turned, and there was Christopher, a paper coffee cup in each hand. He handed one to her without asking. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his briefly. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. He sat beside her, the quiet between them companionable, not strained. For a while, neither spoke. Seagulls cried overhead, the city stretched and yawned awake, and the smell of brine carried faintly on the wind. Finally, Christopher broke the silence. "You're not just fighting for yourself, you know. What you did last night, it exposed rot we needed to clean out anyway." Emily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I didn't think I was fighting for anyone. I couldn't let it stand." Christopher nodded thoughtfully. "That's what makes it matter." He sipped his coffee, then glanced at her sideways. "You're stronger than you think, Emily." She looked down at the cup in her hands, fingers tightening slightly around the cardboard sleeve. "I don't feel strong," she murmured. Christopher smiled faintly. "Strength isn't a feeling, it's a choice." They sat like that, until the sun fully crested the horizon, until the ache in Emily's chest softened enough for her to breathe deeply again. When they stood, Christopher touched her arm lightly. "You know where to find me if you need backup." Emily smiled, small, grateful, real. "Thank you, Christopher, for everything." As she walked away, the city stretching out before her, Emily felt something stir deep inside. Not a roaring fire, not yet, but a spark, a flicker. She would go home today, or what was left of home, and she would walk through those rooms one last time. She would take what was hers, leave what wasn't, and close the door behind her. There was no fantasy of forgiveness, no daydream of reconciliation. There was only the hard, beautiful truth of beginning again. She didn't know exactly where she was heading yet, only that she was finally, unquestionably, moving forward. And for now, that was enough. Emily stood at the entrance of the house she had called home for 10 years, a place that once embodied every dream she had dared to carry. Her fingers rested lightly on the doorknob, the metal cool against her skin. For a moment, she simply breathed, steadying herself, because she knew what awaited inside wasn't just a collection of furniture and walls. It was the echo of a life she was about to walk away from. The house was quiet. She stepped into the front hallway, her heels clicking softly on the polished wood floor. The scent of lavender cleaner still lingered in the air, familiar and intimate. She remembered the first time she walked through this house with Jonathan, hand in hand, imagining holidays, family dinners, late-night talks by the fireplace. She had imagined a future within these walls, brick by brick, belief by belief. But dreams, she now understood, weren't built on houses. They were built on people. And sometimes, when the person beside you slipped away, the walls lost their magic, becoming only wood, stone, and hollow space. Emily moved from room to room, noting quietly what she would take. Her bookshelves, packed with volumes that had shaped her mind. The small painting from a local artist she'd bought with her first paycheck. A photo of her parents, smiling on their wedding day, framed in silver. These were hers, not because they had value to anyone else, but because they anchored something deep inside her, the parts of herself she was determined to reclaim. She reached the master bedroom and stood still for a long moment. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains half drawn, casting muted sunlight across the carpet. She sat gently on the edge, her eyes resting on the indentation in the mattress where she had once curled herself, night after night, waiting for Jonathan to come home. How many times had she told herself to be patient, to be understanding, to be better, as if the fault had been hers? She ran a hand along the duvet, feeling the faintest tremor in her fingers. This was the place she had felt most alone, even before she knew about the affair. This was where the silence had first started to hollow her out. A knock at the door startled her. She rose, smoothing the fabric of her blouse with trembling hands, and walked back to the front entrance. It was Jonathan. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. He looked tired, disheveled, his shirt rumpled, his hair slightly askew. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his expression held something she hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability. "Emily," he said softly, "can we talk?" She held the door only partially open, bracing herself. "I don't know if there's anything left to say." Jonathan let out a shaky breath. "I know I've destroyed everything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even fully understand. But you have to believe me. I never stopped loving you. I got lost. I made mistakes." Emily felt the familiar pull, the old reflex to comfort, to rescue, to soften her stance. But something inside her remained still, unwavering. "You didn't make mistakes, Jonathan," she said quietly. "You made choices." He winced as if the words physically struck him. "Please, Emily, please don't throw us away. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can—" She shook her head slowly. "You're not hearing me. This isn't about throwing us away. It's about recognizing that us, the version we built, is already gone. You left it long before I ever knew to look." Tears sprang to Jonathan's eyes, and he stepped forward slightly, but Emily raised her hand, stopping him. "I need to finish packing," she said softly. "Please let me do that." Jonathan stood frozen in the doorway, then nodded stiffly and stepped back. Emily closed the door gently, leaning against it for a long moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle into her bones. She didn't cry. She had thought she might, but instead, she felt an eerie sense of clarity. She understood now, more fully than she ever had, that love without respect, without truth, without shared commitment, was only an empty shape. a husk of something once whole. She gathered her things calmly, methodically, and by late afternoon the last box was packed. As she moved it to the car, she paused to take one final look at the house. There was no cinematic flourish, no grand swell of emotion. Just a quiet farewell, a silent acknowledgement that this chapter was over. Driving away, Emily felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly with each mile. She didn't know exactly where the road would take her, but she knew one thing. She was no longer circling the same dead ends. She arrived at the loft and found a message from Christopher waiting on her phone. "Update when you're ready. I'm here if you need backup." She smiled faintly. There was no need to rush. Tonight she needed to be alone with her own company, her own thoughts. She unpacked slowly, arranging her belongings in the temporary space, feeling the unfamiliarity of it settle around her like a thin layer of dust. As evening fell, Emily wrapped herself in a soft sweater, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window. She watched the city glow and shift, lights flickering on, casting long shadows across the streets. She let the silence hold her, not the aching silence of an empty marriage, but the peaceful quiet of solitude chosen on her own terms. She thought about the meetings ahead, lawyers, mediators, financial negotiations. She knew there would be moments when it would hurt all over again, when anger and grief would rear up, threatening to pull her under. But she also knew that something had fundamentally shifted inside her. She had stepped off the path of pleasing, of sacrificing, of waiting. She had stepped onto a path of her own making. It was a strange thing, she reflected, to rediscover oneself, not in the triumphs, but in the wreckage. To find that the breaking point was also, somehow, the starting point. Later that night, Emily opened one of her old leather notebooks, the ones Jonathan used to tease her about. She flipped through pages filled with past thoughts, old goals, buried ambitions. She smiled softly, running her fingertips over the inked words. She began to write. Not about Jonathan, not about the affair, not even about the divorce. She wrote about herself, who she was, who she wanted to be, what she wanted to build next. She wrote late into the night, the words flowing not from pain, but from reclamation, from the slow, steady, fierce reclaiming of her own life. And when she finally set the pen down, her hand aching slightly, Emily realized something that took her by surprise. She was tired, yes, exhausted, even, but she was no longer drained. For the first time in a long time, she was filling back up, and that, she knew, was only the beginning. Emily sat at a small wooden desk tucked into the corner of the loft, the early morning light casting pale golden streaks across the blank page in front of her. Her pen hovered, unmoving, as if the weight of everything she had lived through had finally caught up, demanding space, demanding acknowledgement. Outside the window, the city stirred, humming to life. But inside, there was only stillness, broken by the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. She thought back to the days just after the confrontation, the hours spent sorting through paperwork, reviewing legal drafts, attending meetings that left her both energized and utterly drained. Her lawyer had been sharp, efficient, unfailingly professional, guiding Emily through each step with a clarity that felt like oxygen in the midst of a storm. Christopher had been there too, a steady presence on the professional front, but more than that, a reminder that she wasn't isolated. She was building something, even as something else collapsed. But today, Emily had promised herself, was not for paperwork, not for lawyers, not for mediators, not for emails. Today was hers. She placed her pen down, rising slowly. She dressed deliberately. Nothing flashy, just a soft sweater, dark jeans, her hair left loose around her shoulders. She caught her reflection briefly in the mirror by the door and paused, taking in the woman looking back at her. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, a tightness in her jaw she didn't remember from before, but there was also something steadier in her gaze. She wasn't sure she would call it strength yet, but it was something. Emily left the loft and walked through the city, not with a destination in mind, but with the intention of moving, of feeling herself in the world again. She wandered down familiar streets, past the little cafe she used to stop at on the way, to her old office, past the bookstore where she and Jonathan had once spent lazy Sunday afternoons browsing shelves. She felt a pang as she passed these landmarks, a tightness, a faint pulse of old sadness. But she kept walking, letting the memories rise and fall like gentle waves rather than storms. Eventually, she found herself in a quiet park on the edge of the bay. The water sparkled, restless and bright under the late morning sun. Emily sat on a bench, pulling her knees up slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She closed her eyes. In the stillness, she allowed herself to remember not just the good or the bad, but the whole, the complexity of 10 years spent loving, hoping, compromising, losing. She thought about the moments she had laughed with Jonathan until her sides hurt, the nights they had held each other through whispered fears, the mornings they had built routines that once felt solid and grounding. And then she let herself remember the betrayals, not just the affair, but the slow erosion, the 1,000 tiny absences, the dismissive glances, the way she had disappeared inside her own life without realizing it. Tears slid down her cheeks, not in violent sobs, but in quiet, steady lines. She let them fall. She did not wipe them away. It struck her, sitting there, that healing was not a single decision or a single day. It was not something she could check off a list or muscle her way through. Healing was a series of moments like this, sitting honestly with grief, with anger, with memory, and allowing it to be what it was without rushing past it. When she finally stood, the world felt just a fraction lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because she had stopped pretending it wasn't there. She made her way back to the loft, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on her skin. She brewed a cup of tea, this time taking the time to actually drink it, cradling it in her hands as she watched the light dance across the walls. She thought about calling her sister, about meeting friends for dinner later, about rejoining the world she had pulled back from in her pain. But first, she sat down again at her desk, picking up her pen. This time, the words came more easily. She wrote about the kind of life she wanted to create. Not a list of goals or achievements, but a feeling, a texture, a rhythm. She wrote about wanting to wake up each morning with a sense of purpose that belonged entirely to her, not borrowed from someone else's dreams. She wrote about wanting relationships built on honesty, mutual respect, and shared joy. She wrote about the kind of woman she wanted to continue becoming, one who was unafraid to take up space, to speak her truth, to stand tall even when her knees trembled. Emily lost track of time as she wrote, the sun dipping lower in the sky, shadows lengthening across the room. She paused only when she felt the quiet pang of hunger, a gentle reminder of the body she was slowly learning to care for again. That evening, she did call her sister. They laughed, they cried, they made plans to see each other soon. She accepted an invitation from an old friend for lunch later in the week. She even pulled out her old running shoes, eyeing them thoughtfully as she considered whether she might take up jogging again. Not for punishment or change, but simply to feel her body move through space. And when the night came, as it always did, Emily stood by the window, watching the city settle into its own kind of hush. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the echo of everything she had lost. But she also felt the steady thrum of her own heartbeat, the quiet reminder that she was still here. Still here. She whispered it to herself, not as a declaration, not as a battle cry, but as a simple, steady truth. She was still here, and she was ready. Maybe not for everything, maybe not all at once, but for the next breath, the next step, the next small act of choosing herself. As Emily turned from the window and prepared for bed, she felt the smallest flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. Not just survival, but possibility. And she understood, in a way she hadn't before, that this was not the ending of her story. It was the beginning. Emily's journey was not simply a tale of betrayal, divorce, and rebuilding. It was a profound exploration of what it means to rediscover oneself when the life you've carefully built crumbles beneath your feet. From the outside, she had the picture-perfect life, a decade-long marriage, a beautiful San Francisco home, and the quiet pride of knowing she had supported her husband's rise in his career. But beneath that surface was a woman who had gradually silenced her own dreams, set aside her ambitions, and sacrificed her identity, believing that love was measured in how much you were willing to give up for another. When Emily discovered Jonathan's affair, it was not just the pain of infidelity that shook her. It was the realization that she had disappeared inside her own life. For years, she had made herself smaller, quieter, more accommodating, believing that if she just worked harder, just loved more, just stayed patient, everything would turn out right. But betrayal ripped the blindfold away, forcing her to face a hard truth. Sometimes, even the deepest love cannot survive when it is not matched by respect, honesty, and shared commitment. What makes Emily's story powerful is not just how she confronted Jonathan and Olivia in that fateful restaurant scene, or how she exposed the corporate misconduct that had been festering beneath the surface. It's how, afterward, when the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, she chose not to let her story end in bitterness or defeat. Instead, she embarked on a quieter, more personal journey, the work of healing, reclaiming, and rebuilding. Emily allowed herself to grieve, but she didn't stay stuck in grief. She faced the memories, the regrets, the old joys and old wounds, and then she began to ask herself, gently but persistently, what now? Who am I when I am no longer someone's wife, someone's cheerleader, someone's shadow? She reconnected with old friends, rediscovered hobbies she'd once loved, and slowly, carefully, began sketching out a life that was hers alone. One not defined by what she had lost, but by what she still wanted to create. The deeper lesson of Emily's story is that we are all, at some point, faced with a moment when the ground we stand on shifts. When the relationship, the job, the plan we've clung to slips away. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can let the loss define us, sink us, shrink us. Or we can let it refine us. We can meet ourselves again, stripped of roles and labels, and decide who we truly want to be. For anyone listening, the practical application of Emily's journey is not just about leaving a toxic relationship or confronting betrayal, though, for some, that may resonate deeply. It's about pausing, at whatever stage you are in your life, and asking, am I living a life that feels true to me? Have I silenced parts of myself to keep the peace, to maintain an image, or to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be? Am I willing to face discomfort, uncertainty, and even heartbreak to reclaim my voice, my path, my joy? Emily teaches us that healing is not linear, and it is not instant. It is layered, uneven, sometimes painful, sometimes liberating. It requires patience, community, and most of all, honesty. The honesty to admit when something no longer fits, and the courage to walk away even when you're afraid of what comes next. In today's world, where so many of us measure success by outward appearances, the perfect Instagram feed, the ideal couple photos, the glowing career milestones, Emily's story reminds us that true success is quieter, deeper, and far more personal. It's about waking up in the morning and recognizing the person staring back at you in the mirror. It's about building a life that aligns with your deepest values, even when it means starting over. So if you take anything from Emily's journey, let it be this. You are allowed to outgrow the life you once thought you wanted. You are allowed to change your mind, to rediscover your voice, to choose yourself. And when you do, you may find that the best chapters of your life are still waiting to be written, not in spite of the pain you've endured, but because of the strength you've uncovered through it. Now here's a little question for you to reflect on. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done first after discovering the betrayal? A. Directly confront your partner and demand answers. B. Step back, process your emotions, and carefully plan your next moves. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why you chose that. We'd love to hear your perspective and see the different ways people approach these kinds of challenges. Also, what are your thoughts or lessons from Emily's story? Do you see yourself in any part of her journey? Share your ideas in the comments so everyone can learn from each other. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Your encouragement gives us the motivation to keep creating more thoughtful, meaningful content for you. We can't wait to bring you the next story.